In this video, we're going to do a couple of examples that are a little bit more complicated using completing the square. And I'm going to base this on my previous video where I gave 4 steps for completing the square, which I'm not going to rewrite, but I will put a link for anybody who wants to go ahead and look at that. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. First step, we need to get the terms on the correct side. So at the moment, normally I would have moved the 7 to the right side, but it's already there. So I'm going to actually move it, move the 2x over to the left. So I'm going to rewrite this as 3x squared minus 2x equals 7. And I like to put a little space there for the fact that I'm going to put something in there when I'm completing the square. Okay, so A is not 1, it's a 3, which means I'm going to have to divide everything by 3. And as you can see, this just got really gross really fast. All right. Now, I take the B term and I'm going to divide it by 2 and then square it. Okay, well, that looks horrifying. But when you divide a fraction by 2, or divide with fractions, I should say, what you're doing is technically you're multiplying by the reciprocal, which is 1/2, or taking half. So that becomes 2 over 6, which reduces to 1/3, or you could think of it as canceling those 2's here on the fractions. And then 1/3 squared is 1/9. All right. So I'm going to add 1/9 to both sides. So on the right side, in order to add that, I need a common denominator. So I'm going to multiply this by 3, or you could do this on the calculator. And 21/9 plus 1/9 is going to add up to 22/9. And on the left side, I'm going to factor this. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use my trick. It's going to factor into the number it was right before we actually applied that square. So this is going to factor into x minus, I just realized I've dropped that negative this whole time. This should have been negative 2/3, negative 2/3, negative 2/3, negative 1/3. But when you square it, it becomes a positive 1/9. Okay, so now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Left side, that square disappears and we're left with x minus 1/3. The right side, because it's a fraction, I'm going to break it up and I'm going to put in my plus or minus in the front. Now I can take the square root of 9, that's a 3. Oops, here, I'm running out of space. So this is going to become, actually, let me kind of come up over here a little bit. Have a few more steps. Plus or minus the square root of 22 over 3. Now I'll add that 1/3, and I'll just stick that out in the front. 1/3 plus or minus the square root of 22 over 3. This is a perfectly reasonable place to stop, but you could also take an extra step and put them over one fraction. So 1 plus or minus the square root of 22 all over 3, and they would both be the same answer. Okay, let's try that again. One more kind of not so pleasant problem. So for this one, this is kind of more in the standard form. So I'm going to minus 21, move that C term to the other side. And I'll leave a blank space in there. A is not 1, so I'm going to divide, everything by 2. And that'll leave me with x squared, x squared minus 2x equals, okay, so that's a fraction, but at least the fraction's on the right side. Not as gross that way. Okay, so I'm going to take half of negative 2 and square it. So half of negative 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Okay, so to add the right side, that means I'm going to basically be adding 2 over 2. And it is a negative number. So this is actually going to come out to negative 19 over 2. And on the left side, this is going to factor into x minus 1 squared using my nifty little trick for factoring. All right, so now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And here's where we have a difference finally. I have a square root of a negative number. And it's probably been a while, but a negative is an imaginary number. We call that I. So whenever we have a negative under the radical, we're going to actually rewrite that plus or minus I radical 19, and then I'm going to break it up 2 over radical 2. But on the left side, I just have x minus 1. All right, now, whenever you have a negative, it just becomes I, and there's no longer a negative under the radical. So we're working with imaginary numbers. This also is a problem in that I have a radical in the denominator over here on the right, and we don't leave radicals in the denominator. We rationalize the denominator. So the way I do that is I multiply top and bottom by radical 2. So that's going to give me plus or minus I. So square root of 19 times square root of 2 is square root of 38. And then in the denominator, square root of 2 times square root of 2 is square root of 4, or just 2, which is the point. It gets rid of the radical in the denominator. All right, and this just has an x minus 1. Okay, so last step here is to add the 1. And x will equal 1 plus or minus I radical 38 over 2. Now, another way to write this answer, and this is, by the way, probably how mom is going to have you input the answer. But another way to write this is to put the I at the end. And they do that because imaginary numbers, they like to keep it in the form, oops, that's an 8. A plus BI. So they like to put the I sometimes at the end. Either answer is perfectly acceptable, but you may want to kind of get into the habit of putting I at the end so that it'll match how mom wants you to do the answers.